Hello everyone, it's Jaden from Line of Sight, and today we've got an exciting look at a brand new Sciocast model from the upcoming Kickstarter for Rivenstone. Sciocast is a fascinating new material that has come on the market for miniature games in the last few years. Its main selling points are the relatively simple casting process and inexpensive molds, as well as highly durable, bendable models that hold a great amount of detail. This last point is particularly attractive to me, as I am a father of 3 small children who absolutely love to hold my models, but aren't old enough to know what "be careful" really means. There are, however, some extremely notable downsides to this product. First of all, the machines that make the molds and the plastic pellets themselves are entirely proprietary to the Sciocast company, which is based out of Spain. With international shipping being as awful as it has been for the last year and change, this can be a problem for a company that plans to base its entire product range around a material that they cannot acquire domestically or from multiple sources. Additionally, though I have not had a moment to experiment with this myself, Sciocast models reportedly have very low tolerance for excessive heat, such as the inside of a car on a hot summer's day. Goobertown Hobbies has done a much more in-depth video than I am capable of producing on this topic, and I've linked it in the description for those of you who are interested. As for this particular video, today we're reviewing an Orrix model from Rivenstone's imminent Kickstarter campaign. I received this model from my co-host Bret, who was able to pick up a few of these guys at Adepticon earlier this year. He wrote a nice article about his experiences with the sculpts and Sciocast, and I'll link that in the description as well. I found this model surprisingly simple piece to build, although it has a number of irritating flash lines that run across various parts of the model. Usually this wasn't a huge problem, as the affected areas were easy to scrape clean with a sharp X-Acto knife. Sometimes, however, the lines ran across particularly deep parts of the sculpt, or over areas with high detail. These lines proved far trickier to remove. The combination of flexibility of the material and the difficult places that they had been placed made for a few tense moments as I resorted to more forceful cutting. I have since learned that Sciocast recommends a high grit sandpaper, so if you plan to work with this material much, I recommend getting some, or alternatively, some sandpaper sticks in the appropriate grit count. Overall, the cleaning and building process for this model were relatively painless compared to resin and metal kits, and the low piece count made the actual assembly far faster and simpler than something made out of hard plastic. I found this a nice change of pace from the other model lines that I've been working with, and I would like to try building a few more of these models in the future, to see what the construction is like for both more materially complex figures and those with simpler surfaces. Superglue works incredibly well on Sciocast models, and plastic cement doesn't work at all. This makes sense as there are no plastic polymer chains in Sciocast for the plastic cement to chemically react with. Once I had based and primed the Mini, it was time to get painting. I wanted to see what a purely tabletop set of painting techniques could do with this model, as I often tend to dive too deeply into a complex paint job when I am approaching a new game or a new faction. First off, I tried using layered dry brushing to see how the surface reacted to this quick technique. I ended up using this for both the skin and the fur, and was pleasantly surprised by how nicely the model took paint on both of these areas. The surface of the model is just the right amount of grippy to take the pigment on even flat surfaces like these skin areas, but also smooth enough for more delicate glazes, which I've tried later on. One of the prime methods by which I determine whether or not I like a model, I call the chonkiness scale. That is, does the model have sufficiently bulky and detailed areas that are both interesting and also pleasant to paint? This Rivenstone model cleared that bar with flying colors. Every single piece of this sculpt is beautifully sculpted and designed to be painted on, and you can tell. All of the surfaces are very well differentiated from each other, which makes painting them a joy because you don't have to worry too much about catching other pieces, even with this dry brushing technique that I'm using here. I found myself enjoying painting this model so much that I used more layers of paint than I intended to. I was expecting to do this in about 2 layers of dry brushing, and instead I found myself going back for a 3rd and a 4th, because I wanted to push the intensity of the contrast even higher than I was planning on. You can see here that I've gone to a very pale lilac color, and the original plan was to stop at about a purple. I liked that look so much that I even decided to go back in with a lining brush and pick out the edges of the muscles with some very, very pale purple color. This really makes them stand out, as it gives them a huge amount of contrast compared to the darker areas around them. It also makes the model stand out more visually on the table because the difference in color and tone make it so much poppier than it would be otherwise. Next up, I decided I wanted to try a more texturized way to paint them. So, the leather was the obvious choice for where to do this. I base coated it as per normal, no dry brushing involved here at all, and then instead of going in with highlights and shading colors, what I did instead, as you'll see here momentarily, is I took a brighter color and used it to make textured strokes at the edges of the leather belts and the sheath for this knife here. This is a technique that I'm rapidly growing to love, especially for leather, as it does two things at once. First, it allows you to do highlighting, but not worry too much about blending, which is something that I think a lot of people overthink about. Secondly, it gives you some differentiation in the strokes of the paint that you're using, which makes the leather stand out because it has texture to it. You can see here that I'm working along the edges primarily, and once I've established the edge of the different pieces of leather, I'm going in and I'm hatching in downwards and inwards to make that scuffed up look that leather naturally acquires as it ages. Next, I went in with an even brighter color, and I applied a second layer of scratchy marks all over the place, sticking primarily to the edges, but venturing farther in as needed. For a third different technique, I decided that I was going to try out traditional layering. This is a very dark red that's been mixed quite thinly, and I'm going to apply it to all of the different cloth areas on the model. The goal here, as you can see on the lower area, the belt and, well, skirt area really, is that it dries much darker than it goes on, and so as I apply successive layers of the paint, it will make it more and more opaque. This will also let us use the black primer undercoat to show through and help create deeper shadows. This is one of the best tricks I've found when painting quickly to achieve a dramatic amount of contrast without working too hard on blending. Through this whole process, this model was an absolute joy to paint. The edges were clearly defined, which made edge highlighting extremely easy. The crevices were also easy to fit a brush into, and they were not too misleadingly shallow, I guess is the phrase I would use. You can see here that I'm now layering up with a brighter color red, sticking to the areas that I'd already painted on, and then making them even smaller where the light would be the brightest. It's a common misconception that creating a nicely highlighted piece has to be done with a lot of blending. As you can see, I've done basically nothing here, and it's creating a nice textured effect that cloth would naturally have. Very few things in a model should be perfectly smooth after all, almost nothing in real life is. But stuff like this cloth here, which has a smooth finish to it, can be improved dramatically with a little bit of texture painting, and that also is easier to do in many ways than it is to make a perfectly blended gradient. Here's a good example of those beautiful edges that are perfect for edge highlighting. These little holes in the cloth made a great surface for that technique. This is another example of those chunky details. These beautiful little stitches on the skirt and on the belt knife stood out perfectly and were really easy to catch with the brush, even to the point where if I wanted to, I could highlight them up. Next we come to the bone, and I did something interesting here. I started with a greenish tone. One of the things that I wanted to do was make it stand out from all of the other pale colors that I was using, and so using a cool color as the base makes it pop out and be different from the warmer canvas of the wraps and from the leathers. It's also a really good way to establish a nice base coat, and as the darkest color, you'll be able to highlight up from this very easily compared to a pure black, or even a dark brown. I've been finding that I like painting bone with unconventional base layers. It leads to some interesting looking effects, whether aged or maybe molded or mildewed. Something that makes it have a little more character than just static brown, white, and tan. To highlight the bone, I decided I was going to try a couple of techniques. This is another set of layering on this particular skull here, and I use that for all of the smaller areas on this model, the bone sections at least. It works really well because it gives you a little bit of texture which bone should have, and it also allows you to go very bright. The other thing I tried to do was on this scythe, I guess you would call it. I tried to do some wet blending, because wet blending works differently on every surface. Sciocast was remarkably pleasant to wet blend on, and I found myself able to go from very bright to back to the base tone quickly without having to do multiple passes. You can see here that I'm back to layering, but for really big broad areas, wet blending can be an extremely effective technique for getting a quick gradient where you want one that's reasonably smooth with a little bit of texture left over. Once again, I just want to comment at how beautiful the details on this model were to paint. The brush caught them just right. It was very easy to make them stand out because they were already sculpted to be very distinct from each other. I'm going in with a final highlight on these bones here. There's no real metals on this guy, and so the best way to make the bones be distinct from everything else is to have the brightest reflection, which, if they're polished at all, they would. Polished bone is very reflective. Finally, I felt like all of these warm colors, and even that green is a little bit warm, needed a contrast of some sort. And since I'd chosen purple skin and a red cloth, the best thing was to make a blue. The reason for this is twofold. First of all, it creates a nice cool contrast color to the rest of the model. This helps balance things out and make it not feel like it's monotone, or even though these are bright colors, it can feel very washed out. Secondly, blue and red together make purple. And by using them in combination like this, you draw the whole model together very nicely because the two tones that are present as the contrasting cloth colors come together to make the skin tone. This is a really good trick for a lot of different models and techniques. If you want to draw things together with a 3-color scheme, you can pick a secondary color and then choose 2 colors that make up that secondary color to be cloth or armor accents or glow effects or any number of other things. For this particular piece of loincloth here, I chose to go back to layering, but it's a little bit of a wet blend layer because I was in a hurry. I think I painted this model in just over an hour, including some breaks in the filming to clean up my paint station a little bit. Now, it wouldn't be a model that I painted without just a touch of freehand, and this one's a really minor one that I like to do and I like to encourage new painters to try. Just putting a stripe at the bottom of a piece of cloth can add a whole lot of personality and character to it. Most cultures really like to do borders on cloth. It helps them be stronger, but it also gives them a chance to use them as decoration. And this little pinkish magenta that's slightly more intense than the colors around it helps it stand out. Now, for the base, I felt like this really warm guy needed a really cool contrasting base, so I went with snow. What I like to do for snow is I like to take some woodland scenic snow effects and I like to mix it with gloss medium. This makes it really shiny and reflective even when it's dry. The other thing I like to do, as you can start to see here in a moment, is I like to put it on the base while the base paint is still kind of wet. so I'm putting a very thick layer of the base color paint on there. This does a couple of things. First of all, it makes the snow bond to the base better. But secondly, it also makes it so that, as you can see here, I'm accenting this, it mixes with that brownish color on the base and makes the snow more realistic. Battlefield snow would probably be pretty gross, so even a little bit of untouched snow is just a concession to making it look pretty. Whereas here, I'm adding all sorts of nicks and dents of like dirt and debris that would be naturally kicked into the snow as people were fighting on it. The final touch here is some Tamiya clear red. I put it on a very beat up brush that I'm using as a stippling technique here. I put it on the weapon a little bit, front and back, a little bit on the knuckles. I don't think I put that in the film here. And then I gooped it on the base. Mine dried out pretty considerably because I left it open for a couple of weeks a few years ago, and so it's more of a gloop than anything. But just a little bit on the base, because if you've got some on your weapon, there's probably some on the ground somewhere, and that feels appropriate to me. And here the final model is, all painted up. I really enjoyed painting this piece, and I'm super excited to see what else the team at Broken Anvil Miniatures comes out with to wow us all again. I'm super duper excited for this Kickstarter. I'm excited to paint more Orrix models, and I'm highly suggesting that if you liked this video and you want to experience Sciocast for yourself, as it is a very interesting material, give the Rivenstone Kickstarter a look. They'll be linked in the description. Thanks so much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.